Today's seminar is unique in the schedule this spring. I think it's rare that we take time to pause and think about the large-scale political and economic forces that affect our landscapes, and that's in the School of Natural Resources. We have a lot of people that are interested in landscapes from different reasons. Today's guest is Mr. David Domina. It's been a year-long quest to get him here. I think he himself will tell you that he took himself out of contention for speaking for a year while he tried to push the political discussion in Nebraska, but we're happy that he's here today and is able to be with us finally. He's a 1972 graduate of our College of Law, and he's a trial lawyer with the group that he founded, the Domina Law Group. So I think he has a unique perspective, and he'll talk about that perspective today, working with the legal issues that are important to private landowners in Nebraska. His talk title is Consolidation, Mergers, and Market Domination, and Agriculture's Changing Face. So join me in welcoming Mr. David Domina.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to first test this microphone a little bit and see if somebody in the back will tell me whether it's just ugly or it's okay. Thank you. So I'm going to take that as okay. May I start by just thanking you for investing some of your time and life and energy in listening to this. I'll try to make it worthwhile, but you have to help. Questions in the course of what I try to say or have to say will be welcome at any point in this conversation. You don't have to wait until the end. I want to start by saying that it may be that at least on this campus at the university, hearing a lawyer talk about agriculture is a little bit unusual. And I think maybe lawyers do have a little bit of a different view of agriculture than others. And as we just discussed, sometimes that might be a prescient view of what is to come. Sometimes it is a rear view mirror's view of the wreckage that has already happened when things didn't go well. But each is a little bit different and a little bit unique. As we go along today, one of the things I'm going to do is to teach a seed corn sack. And I want to ask now, has anybody here ever taught a seed corn sack? Or has anybody ever studied a seed corn sack? All right, at least you can get that much new experience out of what will happen during the course of the next few minutes. You probably all heard the news today that Nebraska in 2014 lost 500 farming units out of approximately 50,000, or 1% of the farmers actively engaged in production agriculture in our state disappeared, went out of business last year. You may have also heard, and probably saw if you looked at a summary of the USDA's statistics, that the average size of the Nebraska farming and ranching operation in 2014 increased by 7 acres. Now those numbers don't square up, because 500 is pretty nearly 1%. But 7 acres of increase is not 1% increase in size. It's more like 0.7 of 1%. So one might ask what happened to the other acres, and maybe that's still to be accounted for. But there are really interesting things going on in the demographics of Nebraska agriculture. I want to report one of them. And it's a report based on personal conversations of the last 90 days. In the last 90 days, I've had 7 separate groups of Nebraska farm families or owners approach me about assistance to relocate their investment in Nebraska farmland to a state east of Nebraska, one of 2 or 3 or 4 states east of Nebraska. And in each instance, their reasons for wanting to relocate their investment were these. First, I'm afraid of the regulation of water. Second, I'm afraid of the marginal cost of production that is compelled by the need for water in Nebraska, both its cost or future cost and the current costs of power and irrigation systems and the catch-up with eastern states in the cost of our land. And the third thing that I've heard them mention repeatedly is Nebraska is utterly and entirely non-competitive for its tax structure. Now those things, in the context of one lawyer's practice, a lawyer who does not ordinarily do transactional work, that's a huge canary in a coal mine. And I would encourage everybody associated with this institution to be focused on what the multiplier effect of that means to lawyers who do transitional work and are involved in representing people in production agriculture on a regular basis. I don't think it's adequate to look at the history of 2014's demand for land, price for land, demand for rents, or price for rents for production land. I don't think that's a very good indicator, because that tends to be a trend that follows with what the production value of the previous year or the previous 3 or 5 years' crops were. But when the brightest producers, who made their investments at a time, and you look back at their lives and you see they did, when they saw an opportunity and they capitalized on water, they capitalized on low-cost land, they made their fortunes by timely investments, and they are now reinvesting because they have those same skills plus the advantage of age. There is a message in that for the state of Nebraska, and that is a policy message. About 2 weeks ago, I was asked by a group of farmer clients who I do work for in northeast South Dakota near Aberdeen to come up and talk to them about a subject that is much in the legal community's news at the moment and has at least some effect on agriculture, and that's this array of Syngenta lawsuits that are the subject of advertising on television and rushes to attract farm clients in a way that farmers aren't accustomed to. It's more like late-night TV advertising, and it doesn't seem very becoming to us. The producers had been rushed by some other people from another state, and they called and said, "Why don't you just take a look at what this is and come up and tell us what it's about?" So I did that. And as I did that, I thought about how much communication in agriculture has changed and how much the relationship between farmers and those who sell them critical inputs for their operations have changed. I've taught the seed corn bag before, but I decided that there would be no better opportunity to illustrate a lot of what I'd like to communicate to you today than to simply look at a very ordinary object familiar to everybody in Nebraska farming. And I happened to choose Pioneer only because I had about one a year for the last 10 or 15 years of these in my office. And we all recognize Pioneer. We all recognize its logo. But how many of you, if any, have ever read the back of the bag? How many of you have ever purchased seed corn? A few. How many of you in the room believe that today it is possible to purchase title, that is absolute ownership, to seed corn? Anybody? A few do. Okay, I give you an A for being courageous. I think there were more who thought that. But the fact is that this bag declares, as does a lengthy contract that it incorporates by reference, that seed is sold to Nebraska producers under a license arrangement. And that license arrangement permits the purchaser to use the seed for limited purposes. And those limited purposes are definitional of what the ownership of the seed means. And the constriction on ownership, which is really, you don't own it, you're permitted to use it for licensed purposes, is a really, really important legal point. So one of the things on this bag is, you use this seed, and you accept as if you signed our 30-page, 10-point, single-spaced contract. If you open the bag and use it, you're presumed to have assented to all of those terms, and one of them is, you can use this seed for the limited purposes expressed in our license. Now, for most people, those limited purposes are pretty broad and maybe even adequate. You can use the seed for feed, or you can use the seed to sell commercially to somebody else who will grind it up and destroy it, or feed it to an animal where it can't be used experimentally, it can't be replanted, and it can't be used in any way other than as a feedstuff or other method whereby it is destroyed, like using it in an ethanol plant. Here's the mystery to me about that part of the bag. The same farmer who buys that seed, not really paying much attention to the bag, not paying much attention to that 30-page contract. I have yet to meet one who's read them. I've had a few ask me to. Not very many. Goes over to Farm Credit or to the local bank and pledges the crop as collateral on a loan. And as is true of everything you deliver to a bank or every document you sign at or for a bank, you represent to the bank that the information delivered is true and accurate, and the penalty for not delivering the truth or not speaking with accuracy is that you commit a federal crime, a felony, publishable by a minimum of 1 year of incarceration. With a good judge, that turns into 10 months if you get a year and a day, because in the federal system, a year and a day will get you good time and a flat year won't. But one of the things you tell the bank if you sign its forms is, I own my crop. The same farmer who signed a license that says you don't own it, you can use it under a license, tells the bank, I own it. That's an example of the kind of thing that's going on with agriculture and communication between producers and those who supply inputs to their operations, including seed and money. They speak different languages through forms and complex documents that aren't reconciled and can, in those instances when somebody like me is necessary, produce an enormous conflict that is not only disabling but may even be criminal for the producer. I challenge you at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln and the College of Agriculture to start thinking about the need to reconcile those considerations. The person you keep out of prison may be your student. And I am serious about that. This bag contains a whole host of other things that I think that we need to know about. It contains a warranty. And this is the warranty. And this is Pioneer, but it's all of them. Warrants that the seed or other products purchased from it conform with the descriptions on the label within tolerances, if any, permitted by law. That's it. That's the warranty. This is the label. The label discloses the pesticides or pesticide problems, the herbicide or herbicide problems, and says you bought this thing and you open this sack subject to the license. And you're controlled by the license. So read our 32-page agreement on our website, because you, by taking the thread out of the end of this sack, assented to those terms. But there's more. After the warranty on this bag, the next thing that I read is a disclaimer of warranty. So that every single solitary warranty created by every single state legislature in the United States and by the United States Congress is disclaimed. Then it says liability is limited. And essentially the limitation on liability for breach of the warranty, that the product doesn't conform with the one warranty you got, which is that it's legal seed under the tag and nothing else, is limited to replacing the seed. And then it goes on to say, prompt notice of claim. You've got to tell us immediately, and we'll define what immediately is, and if you don't do that, you don't get the seed back either. And then after that, the statute of limitations. Now, the Nebraska legislature has said our statute of limitations on written contracts is 5 years. On non-written or oral contracts and on torts, it's 4 years. Here, the contractual limitation, the statute of limitations, that's the title, statute of limitations. Statutes are ordinarily passed by Congresses or legislatures. 1 year. The hell with those states. And we don't need that United States Congress, because you just opened our bag and you assented to our contract and you agreed to our terms, and this is one of them. You consent to jurisdiction. Pay no attention to the fact that you ordered the seed in Pierce County, it was delivered in Pierce County, you planted it in Pierce County, you had a problem with it in Pierce County, you reported the problem to your seller in Pierce County, your agronomist is from Pierce County and was trained at the University of Nebraska. You just chose the law of Iowa. Furthermore, you don't get to use your court in Pierce County. You don't get to have your neighbors adjudicate your dispute in Pierce County. You chose arbitration. And when you chose arbitration, you didn't choose objective arbitration. You chose arbitration in Iowa under the terms of arbitration set forth by Pioneer in that 30-page, 10-point type, single-spaced contract that you didn't see because it's on the website and you didn't read the bag. Pay no attention to the Seventh Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, or Article 1, Section 21 of the Constitution of Nebraska, and your right to have your neighbors decide your problem, or you to decide theirs. And then you go on beyond that with the bag, and you see that it says that in bold letters that the use restrictions and limited license are re-emphasized. The parental lines are proprietary. We'll take your firstborn, since that's a matter of lineage, if you violate our parental rights to this product. And by the way, if there's anything on this bag or anything in our contract that is so onerous that a court won't enforce it because one of you finds a judge that won't go with us, then that one provision, that's severable from all of the rest. All of the rest of our terms and conditions apply. And this seed bag, plus the documents that it incorporates, and the documents that it excludes, including the law of your state, the law of all of the other states, the law of the United States, that's our entire agreement. And there ends the bag. Now, here's the problem with concentrated agriculture markets. We don't have a producer in Nebraska. We don't have 10 producers in Nebraska collectively who are big enough to negotiate against that company for different contract terms. We couldn't take our top 100 producers and have them band together and to negotiate for different terms against that company. That contract is a classic contract of adhesion, meaning that it's exactly the kind of contract that at one time in the history of this country, a furniture rental company could not enforce because they were too ridiculously onerous to be valid. But now, we enforce them against everybody. You signed one with your cell phone. You consented to arbitration. Look at your credit card. Was it issued by MasterCard or Visa or American Express? You consented to one of those contracts. You gave up all of those rights and all of those opportunities, and you did it because we are all free to contract. So here's the change in the landscape that I see affecting Americans and American agriculture. There are those who write the contracts and understand them, and there are those who are subject to them. It isn't necessary to say who signed them. You don't have to sign them anymore. You have to use the product, even unwittingly, to be stuck with the consequences of the adhesion contract. Open your cell phone, turn it on, make a call, you've consented. Swipe your credit card one time, pay the bill at the end of the month, never pay an ounce of interest, you've consented. Cable companies, rental car companies, the airline industry, you name it. So what has been given up in that process? Focusing specifically on agriculture. Well, I want to recall some images that I had seen several times before, but I wanted to see again, anticipating this conversation. And I had to be in court yesterday in Hyannis in Grant County. So the night before last, I stayed in Broken Bow at the Arrow Hotel. If you haven't stayed there, it's a great place. Great place. And I went out and looked at Nebraska's largest feed yard, which I'd seen many times before. And I know that that feed yard, at 120 or 30,000 head of capacity on a daily basis, probably full yesterday it looked like, has displaced at least 120,000 cattle feeders. I know that Nebraska has, at least some Nebraskans have declared with pride in the last year that we are the largest beef producing state now in the United States. We're ahead of Texas. That's true. But we have about half as many people raising those animals as we had in 2004. About half. We have fewer than half as many people working in that industry as we had in 2004, except at slaughter plants. And we have working at slaughter plants people in our state who have made Vietnamese our third language, who until the last few days at least couldn't vote without an ID and couldn't get a driver's license, and often couldn't work in agriculture. At least not without fear for themselves and some fear for a conscientious boss. My brother farms in Cedar County, sells Syngenta, by the way. He has trouble getting help. His oldest son graduated from here, from your programs at the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources, a College of Agriculture graduate. Went home to farm. Tragically for my brother, he died at age 24, not of an accident, but of a condition, a physical condition. It about broke my brother's heart, but he recovered. And he's done well. He's a pretty good-sized farmer. He has no ability of any kind whatsoever to negotiate for any kind of freedom from that sort of limitation that we just went through. He feeds some cattle. He can't really sell those cattle for cash because there isn't a cash market. He has to look for a way to buy them and then hedge them, which means sell them before they're finished, because if he doesn't do that, the odds are that at the time they're ready to go, there's no margin in those cattle. They're a losing proposition. The cash market for our number one commodity in agriculture in Nebraska is gone. The cattle market has almost no cash component anymore. The hog market. In 1984, and all of you who are a little older remember what was going on in the 80s. Nebraska banks were failing. Farmers were failing. Lawyers like me were trying to help figure out how to keep them on the farm in a 19% interest climate. A friend of mine and I bought a little rural bank. Now that might sound like something of a deal today, but in 1984 they were practically giving them away because they were failing. And if somebody had the idiocy to take one over, you could have the darn thing if you could make it work. When we took that bank over, about 40% of our loan portfolio was in hogs. Today, we do not have one swine pledged as collateral for one loan because we don't have any meaningful hog production in this state except in a few highly concentrated hands. And the reason our producers are concentrated is because the people they sell to are concentrated. The reason our feed yards are big is because the people they sell to are big. And it's more efficient to make fewer stops, contract in advance, and acquire ahead of time the cattle and the hogs that you need to run a slaughter plant. It's also more efficient to deal with only one farmer if you run an elevator or a grain company instead of 30 or 40 or 50 or 80. And that explains why we're down to under 50,000 producers in the state. 50,000 Nebraska producers. 49,100, I think, today, according to the USDA. We're a state that is 1/2 of the population of the United States. 1.8 million people. Our producers are such an infinitesimal part of our own population that they have no market power, and we have increasingly divested them, even in Nebraska, of political power. The only way to correct some of those problems is to do it with the legal process, and that means either making law or upsetting things so much in the court system that public policy has to respond. We have emphasized in the United States one thing over another that appears to me to be the definitional change in the landscape of agriculture. We have rewarded, cherished, advanced, propagated production. Production. More and more and more and more production. More per acre. Faster gain. Bigger animals. Fewer animals. More bushels per acre. Bigger farms. More and more production. And each time we have done that, we have enhanced the possibility that those people who respond with success can stay on the farm at the expense of the people who are not quite capitalized well enough, not quite technologically savvy enough, not quite nimble enough with a head start from family, not quite something else. The consequence of that is that diminishing from our midst is a whole kind of citizen. The citizen that is produced by a childhood on a farm or a ranch. That is the vanishing commodity of American agriculture, and it is cheating the United States. It's happening because our production is matching the demand in the marketplaces it sells to, and we are allowing it to consolidate to the point where we don't have kids in rural Nebraska and we don't have them in rural America anymore. And if you doubt that I'm right, you haven't been out of Lincoln enough. I was in a whole lot of small towns and rooms in the last year, and in all of my years, frankly. Not much new about it in the last year. The presentation style was a little different. That's all. The average age is my age. And you know what? People my age aren't having kids. And that's a problem. Not that we aren't, but that rural Nebraska isn't. I graduated from Coleridge High School. It doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. My first wife graduated from Oconto High School. It's gone. My wife of 27 years graduated from Valley City High School in Valley City, North Dakota. It's still there. It's about the size of, maybe about the size of Seward. And it's got a little college, sort of like Seward. Doesn't have a downtown anymore. The stores are all closed. It's got a Walmart out on the hill. The college looks a little neglected, even though North Dakota's got pretty good resources. It's a state college. The town doesn't look as crisp as it did as she remembers it, sort of like Coleridge doesn't. Rural agriculture is struggling. Rural Nebraska is struggling. Every one of our counties has a 1% and a 99%. In the last year, while speaking with a master's degree teacher in a public school system in Kearney, where there's a state university, quite a bit of apparent drive-through on 2nd Avenue prosperity, I heard stories that led to other stories by other teachers about teachers in our public schools, even in Buffalo County, taking a little bit of food to school with them in the morning so they could get the student to noon when the child would have the only meal of the day. I remember visiting in Lexington and looking over the screen of a person working at the administration of the public schools in Lexington. By the way, I talked in Gothenburg last night about water and Syngenta, so a little ways from there. I suppose last night my crowd, the successful farmers who were there, they may have had an average net worth of several $million apiece. But in Lexington, on the day I was there, there were 3,000, I think I remember correctly, 3,003 students in the school system. 499 of those students were classified by the school district as homeless, which meant they were either living with some 2 or 3 other groups in 1 or 2 rooms, staying at a motel, or not that well off. In Nebraska, in a part of the state where the land is the richest, the production is the best, in Nebraska, where there's plenty of water, in Nebraska, where none of us are paying enough attention, and in Nebraska, where even our most successful are being diminished by things like this. So the changing landscape of agriculture is the changing landscape of failing to emphasize opportunity in favor of production, which gives rise to more consolidation, which means that when you want a grant to do research at your university, you get the grant from one of the companies that produces that kind of a bag, and you are expected to produce a result for them, or you don't get it back the next time. And everyone in this room knows that's true. It hurts to admit it, and we seldom say it out loud. I have a son who's a professor at a state university. My eyes have been completely opened to what I expected about the grant system. It's not what your people want. It's not what your state wants. And it's most important, more than what they want, it's not what they need. Those 499 kids in Lexington, they need a home. Their parents need a job. That job needs to pay enough so they can keep body and soul together. They have to be welcome enough so they can get a driver's license and have a chance. There's no Domina registered at Ellis Island. Someplace, somewhere, somebody before me came here illegally to work in agriculture and then to buy a piece of ground and then to eventually graduate from a high school and then to produce a first-generation kid who could come here. And not so we could screw it up. I think it's really important for you and for me to be of service to those producers who are asking questions about what's going to happen with water. Should I relocate my investment? What's going to happen to Nebraska? Can we get a handle on our tax system? Can we remain competitive? Are we going to be marginalized out of production because we've got to buy a pivot and we've got to pump water, and the people east of us selling their crops into the same market we are don't have to? Will those costs drive us out? Or will our land prices adjust so much that they make up the difference, which will be cataclysmic for people who have expanded significantly in the last few years? And by the way, for those of you in the room who aren't economists, who might say, well, don't worry about that, there's a lot of equity, I want you to think of how quickly that equity disappears when you decide to spread it over some new land because you've got some that's paid for, and then you take a $2 bushel loss. And then your interest rate goes up from 5% to 9%, or 6% to 11%. Or when you look at the charts that show the cycles of how it happens over and over again, and we don't learn it. I encounter people almost every day in my practice who are in trouble with something because they thought they knew better. They thought they were a step quicker. They thought they were a little bit smarter. Some of them were just unlucky. Some of them, it was hubris that produced their mistakes. I can see right now in Nebraska agriculture that most of that is gone. As I talk to people about the incredible problem of allowing our state's water policy to be set by the Republican River Basin statewide, I can see the farmers of northeast Nebraska, the farmers of the Platte River Valley, looking at me riveted with wide eyes, absolutely understanding that that's bad policy. But it's happening. When I talk a little bit about the problem of that bag and going to the bank, and a conscientious one says, "What do you think I should tell the bank?" I can't say anything to the seed company. I say, scratch out I own the crop. Write in, I have a license to use it under the terms of the seed corn company's SAC. Scratch it out. Take the time. Scratch it out. Why put yourself in a position someday when you're in trouble because you couldn't pay a USDA loan in time, when you got a grant that you didn't have work out, when something else goes wrong in your life, why put yourself in a position to be at the mercy of a prosecutor from Omaha or Lincoln who doesn't know anything about how it works on the farm? Who can't for the life of them begin to understand that you didn't get it, that you were buying seed under a license. You thought you owned it. Scratch it out. It's not worth the risk. And when I hear production, and I hear it from farmers who are in the game, I think they have no choice. It's good. They should be trying to produce more. They're doing exactly what they should be doing. But when I hear it from people not in production agriculture, in education, in public policy, in industry, I think to myself, it's up to you to turn this thing in a different direction. We don't have to be a country with 3 meatpacking choices, 3 or 4 grain choices, 3 or 4 seed choices, and 1 company essentially with virtually all of the traits. We don't have to be that. And the key to that starts with how we educate people to be effective at using the knowledge that you impart to them. This is perhaps the defining education-based observation of my life of the last few years. At community colleges, I hear instructors and I hear and see students talk about starting businesses. And at universities, I hear them talking about getting jobs. Flip it. We need to be teaching people who want and aspire and insist on owning something, building something, employing someone. Because ownership gives you at least some room to have some impact on policy that is denied most employees. Think about it. You work for one of those, are you going to speak up on an issue that isn't friendly to the company? But you own a farm, you might speak up. And I know that can happen, and here's how I know. After I tried the beef antitrust case in 2004, Pickett versus Tyson, some raisin farmers in California called and they had a problem with their marketing order. And they wanted to know, since they thought I had a horse that was white and I had a hat that was white, and they were wrong, they wanted to know if I'd come out and help them. And I thought, gosh, when am I going to get a chance to go to California and learn something about the raisin industry? So I did. And here's what happened. I learned, first of all, that almost all of the raisins in the United States are produced within 75 miles of Fresno. Now, guess why? It's so dry at harvest time there that traditionally when you harvest grapes, you take them off the vine, you lay them on a piece of paper, and they'll dry out because there is no dew, so they don't mildew. That's why they're raised there. So you've got a little bitty laboratory, 75 miles in diameter around Fresno, California, that commands an entire industry. And I thought to myself when I got there, I just went through this massive, terrible, demanding beef antitrust case. I could have been working on raisins. Right here it is. It's a laboratory. And so I went to work on raisins. And they needed to get rid of their marketing order. And what had happened was that they had essentially one choice where they could sell their raisins in a marketing order that prohibited them as producers from selling them directly outside the state of California. And that was the USDA marketing order. So these folks who hired me decided, look, we're going to go broke because the margins commanded by our one monopsonistic outlet are so small that they're going to break us. We can see it. And their population was even older than our producer population now. So they bought the iron and put up a plant and openly defied the marketing order. The marketing order for raisins, by the way, said this: we, the USDA, will decide every year what fraction of your crop you can sell. The rest of it you have to put in reserve. We will then tell you next summer what the price is for that part reserved, up to 50%. We can't force you to reserve more than 50%. So they were often permitted to sell 55% of their crop. They had to warehouse without compensation 45% of the crop. They couldn't affect the price, and the USDA would tell them what it was after the fact, after they were told to ship them and they were gone without knowing. And of course what happened was that the USDA started to use a part of our raisin crop to influence foreign policy, to support whatever the goal was in a different country, which meant we had to lower the price in order to get it into a federal budget with more constraints. So the amount paid for the reserve went down farther and farther, and our raisin farmers were going broke left and right. And these guys just said, look, what difference does it make? They're going to take our farms one way or another. Let's defy it, which they did. And they started that in 2005. In 2013, the lead plaintiff, Marvin Horn, and his wife, Laura. Marvin is a trained CPA who doesn't practice. He worked for the state of California Department of Agriculture at one time as an inspector of some kind, and then as a bean counter of some kind, and then bought what they call a raisin ranch out there, which is usually 20 to 40 acres. Raisin ranch. Kind of a cool term, I guess. Marvin's the head of this. Now, Marvin's not a very likely renegade. He's a CPA. But Marvin's going to go broke or give it a try. So he started to fight him. I tried a case for him, an administrative law case for a couple of weeks. He lost. We appealed. He lost. We appealed again. He lost. We petitioned the United States Supreme Court for certiorari. He was turned down. At that point, he's essentially broke and he's about to face huge fines, so he starts to fight the fines. And by this time, even a lawyer who's willing to volunteer to help, they can't afford the airplane ticket, literally. So they got somebody local to take over and literally recycled the first generation of briefs over and over again. And in 2013, the United States Supreme Court took Marvin Horn's case. Now, the United States Supreme Court takes 80 cases a year. They get about 9,000 petitions for writ of certiorari. They happen to take Marvin's. The United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of Marvin and his renegades 9-0. During the oral argument, Justice Scalia said to the government's lawyer, the Solicitor General of the United States, arguing the case personally, is there a dumber law than the raisin marketing order anywhere on the books? Verbatim. Now, The case was reversed and remanded to the Ninth Circuit. Marvin goes back with a 9-0 victory of the U.S. Supreme Court. The Ninth Circuit rules against Marvin again. In April, the United States Supreme Court will hear Marvin's case again. What's my point? One guy who got a few neighbors together and said, look, we're going broke anyway. We can't put up with this concentrated market, we'll fight it. Got himself to the Supreme Court of the United States not once, not twice, and the worst he can do if he gets beat 9-0 is to say, well, it was 9-9. Now, what I want you to do is to train a Nebraska farmer with that much gut to stand up against this and to reverse those 49,100 producer numbers and get us more farmers in this state. That's the change in the landscape of agriculture I want to see. And I'll tell you candidly, every single solitary day when I go to work, like it or not, I can't get over my ag background. I can't shake Cedar County out of me, and I don't want to. So I take some delight in doing one little thing a day, whatever it is, to make it a little bit tougher for the people who print these bags and the things like it. Knowing that I can't get enough done. But my brother's daughter and her husband now live in the house I grew up in. And they now farm with my brother. And they've got 4 children. And they're worth it. It's home we're fighting for. It's a kind of person that comes from agriculture that we're fighting for. Every day, that's the job. For all of us. Here ended the sermon for the day. Questions?
I'm going to ask that as we do questions, we use the microphone so we can get them on tape, please.
David, you just spent a year talking to 300,000 or 400,000 Nebraskans about these very issues. 15 years ago, a native Kansan who lives on the East Coast wrote a book called What's the Matter with Kansas? And essentially what Thomas Frank pointed out is every single time an opportunity arises for a voter to support someone who would do something about that bag, all the way from Brownsville, Texas, up to the Canada line, they vote against that candidate. What's the matter with Kansas?
Well, first of all, let me say this. I don't have the... I'd have to say I get up in the morning and I'm glad that I didn't get elected. I'm also glad that I ran. I learned a lot about myself. I learned some more about the state. I don't know that I learned a lot more about Nebraskans that permits me to answer that question. And I'm not sure they do vote against their interests altogether. There are a lot of Nebraskans who would vote against a person who would say the things I say, thinking that, that isn't what we want or need. That isn't right. We need to focus on production. I respect that point of view. I think it's a legitimate argument. I just think the advocacy needs to be much more forceful and centered the other way, and I think most people would tend to agree with what I said today if they really thought about it. But thinking about it is complicated. It is painful. It does require that you be willing to take just enormous chances yourself. Gosh, that Marvin Horn guy, how can you help just knowing the story as I told it today, but think, that guy's a hero. And if you were to meet him and his wife, they'd be the least likely looking people with the least likely background. And they only did it because their backs were absolutely against the wall. What I think about Nebraska and Nebraskans is this. Nebraskans, for the most part, love the geography of our state. They don't really particularly spend enough time understanding or appreciating how fragile it is. I can see that the people engaged in production agriculture, especially with big equity investments and debt investments, are very concerned about marginal costs. They know they have no bargaining power. They know they're price takers. They absolutely understand what a monopsony is, and they're afraid of it. And they don't know what to do. They're looking for some different kind of leadership that the parties aren't giving them. I've been saying, as I've been talking this last couple of weeks, at every one of these seed corn meetings, and I'm only talking to people about this Syngenta thing by invitation, I also insist they listen to me talk about water a little bit. And I say this at every one of those meetings, Don, and so maybe this is how to affect Nebraskans. I say this: we have a brand new governor, we have a brand new attorney general. Brand new. I have no doubt they both want to be very effective. They are, I think they're sincere. It makes no difference that they come from a different political background from me. I'm giving them all of the benefit of all of the doubt about wanting to be good for the people of the state. Now, farmers, they need to hear from you and not lawyers right now. Right now, as soon as possible, as early as possible. Our Constitution's got it screwed up. We get a new governor, we get a new attorney general, we toss them into a 90-day session. Should be a 60, so they could get their legs under them and then do the 90s in their second and fourth years, but nonetheless, it's the way it is. So I say to them, try to go to a meeting where you can meet one of these guys. And when you do, if nothing else, say this to them. Say, my name's John Doe. I'm an irrigator from Dawson County. Governor, Mr. Attorney General, here's my request of you. Don't let the state's water policy be driven by the Republican River Basin. They're separate problems. You want to do one thing for yourself, do that. They get it. Immediately, the farmers that I say that to get it. They don't need any more explanation. I think the teachers need to hear that. I think the students need to hear that. I think the grocers in rural Nebraska need to hear that. I think they need to be disrupted out of their relatively secure, somewhat under-informed existences, and we all have that. That's not a criticism. I'm under-informed in a lot of areas too. And challenged to do something that is driven by the future and about the future. Let me just, one more thing. I worked for Affiliated Foods, which is a grocery wholesaler, for a number of years, did their work. And they were violently against what they called the death tax, their members. Small grocery store owners, mostly. The estate tax. And I said to him one day, so what are you going to do? You let the Walton family pass its wealth 2 generations, 3 generations? They'll have all of the retail. The estate tax is not a revenue tax, it's an opportunity tax. We should be talking about where you set the exemption, but we can't not have one. And then, once in a while you'd get somebody with some recognition, but that takes some deep thought. We're talking about structural problems with our country that require more than we get out of our non-news news sources. We need to be willing to challenge each other more than we are. And it's comfortable to just exist without challenge. I talked to a woman probably 80 years old, and I'll never forget this, in Burwell. And she was full of all kinds of concerns about rural Nebraska, and then I said to her, what do you think is the number one problem we face? She thought about it for a minute, and she said, I don't know, probably immigration. And I said, why do you think that? And she said, well, I think it's all those illegals coming here taking away jobs. And I knew what I was hearing. I was hearing the morning talk show. So what's wrong with Nebraskans? We don't cherish the fact that we produce as a human type from agriculture, a human type to be cherished that is different. There is something that never separates you from your past once you've helped pull a calf or farrow a sow or pull a pig out of the placenta, or stitch up a displaced abomasum. That was probably a crummy answer, but I got it off my chest.
Hey, Dave, how do we best stress opportunities?
Well, that's a great question, and I'll use an example of something that's currently in the news, and let's do a celebration about it for a minute. You know, I happen to be representing a group of farmers who find themselves in a very odd situation. They're at odds with a big oil pipeline company. And that big oil pipeline company operates outside the country for a profit and wants to build a pipeline across our state, but more importantly to them, across their land, and wants to pay them one time for an easement. Some of those easements will dissect domestic wells from houses. Others will dissect irrigation wells from pivots. They'll all have some adverse impact. And those people found a way to get together to try to resist, not for the sake of resisting, and not for the sake of the open tar sands mine pits in northern Alberta, which we might all have real objections to. But the glue that really binds them together is, look, you're going to make a profit every day. We try to make a profit on this land every year. You want to pay us once, a nominal amount. You're going to take an easement. You're going to try to tell somebody that we still own the surface, and we won't get anything for it. But we'll put up with you for 50 years. Then you're going to abandon the pipeline under our land and leave it to our grandchildren to clean up. And in between, every time there's a spill, you have to clean it up, but you're going to reserve the right to fight with us about who has to pay for it. We won't stand for those things. And those people have been courageous enough to say, you either pay us right, and you take the risk, all of the risk of those spills, unless we shoot the thing with a 30-06 or something criminal, and you take it out of our land and don't leave it to future Nebraskans, or we will fight you to the death. That's the prototype I'm looking for. That's the Nebraskan to celebrate. That's the person who has principles. And that's the person who is not buying into the news stories about that pipeline. Because they've read the easement, they understand the limitations, they know the risks to their own families, to their land, and to our state, and they are willing to be a vocal minority for it. Bless them. And you know what I say about that as a lawyer? You know, it's a lawyer's job to stand up in court and make the argument, whatever it is. It's not about risk to the lawyer. What an honor for me to be able to say to my grandkids someday, you know, I represented Marvin Horn. I represented those farmers who had the guts to do that. I just want them to propagate like mad. Unfortunately, in Nebraska, they're too old, so we need your help.
I have one more question here.
Hi, my name is Hannah, and my PhD research actually takes me up to Holt County every summer from May to August. So I don't actually have a question. I just wanted to say thank you so much and congratulations on your court victory last week.
Thank them and congratulate them. Well, listen, it's been an honor to be here. Thank you very much, and best wishes to you, and go find some of those tough prototypes. Take care.